The thing about statistics is, they're numbers and you might see them as just numbers, but at least in baseball, statistics can represent stories. They can represent your idea, your image of a person, of a
the cost of a ball, how long the ball was used.
How could he have won the Cy Young Award, which is the most coveted award given to a pitcher each year? He wasn't even the best pitcher in the league. Not only that, he wasn't even the best pitcher on his team. Looking at statistics and going deeper into them, you can find the truth.
Hi, everybody. I'm Mike Chung of Auto Care Association. Super happy to have my friend Ben Orlando join us for a talk about baseball. Not often I bring props, but you'll see why we do this today. And really excited to talk with Ben. Ben is a friend of mine I know from a tennis league, and he has his own podcast called The Midnight Library of Baseball. Ben, welcome to the program.
Thanks, Mike. Happy to be here.
So tell us a little bit about yourself. Tell us a little bit about the podcast and how it came about.
Sure. So I was a former English professor. I'm a writer, author, and I'm currently a full-time psychotherapist. So I wrote a book about a female knuckleball pitcher, and my agent and I were talking and thinking of, what would be good to just, get the word out and through something that you can do consistently that you enjoy. And I had a history podcast before, and so I really had gotten back into baseball, which was why I wrote this book, and reading baseball, reading fiction. And so for me, doing a deep dive, doing deep research, and going beyond the normal day-to-day, which is what most baseball podcasts are. Who's getting traded here, what's going on in each game. To me, it was much richer to discuss the history, untold stories, overlooked stories, kind of turning perspectives on their head, asking questions that people weren't even thinking about. So for me, that's what got it started, and that's what led to Midnight Library of Baseball. So it's a podcast, and I also have Instagram, Facebook, hundreds of thousands of downloads, millions of views, and it's really connecting with people in terms of slowing down and kind of remembering what it can be like if you do slow down.
Thanks for that introduction, Ben. And you bring up an interesting point about the stories of baseball slowing down. I've listened to almost all of season 1, and I love your intro and the sort of mood that you set in terms of nostalgic stories of baseball, no loud noises. And it's something that you encourage people to wind down with and really get deep into these histories and the stories of baseball. Am I getting that right, Ben?
Absolutely. Yeah. The point is, as you're listening, it's like you said, it's not winding you up. There's plenty in our life, right? There's plenty in society to wind you up every day. Nonstop action, all of the external stressors. And so it's really necessary, not only mentally, but physically, physiologically, for our bodies to rest. And so this podcast, it's meant to entertain, of course, but also to help slow you down so that you can rest, so that your bodies can rest, which is necessary for repair.
Thanks for sharing that. And some of our listeners might be thinking, okay, Mike, you talk about data, you talk about statistics, and it's a natural fit, especially if you listen to some of the episodes that Ben has on his podcast, because when I listened to the episodes on the topics we're going to discuss today, it made me think about the automotive aftermarket, some of the data that we look at longitudinally. For example, vehicle miles traveled, a bellwether for how people are repairing their cars, maintaining their cars, and what the supply chain, whether manufacturers, distributors, service providers, retailers, might expect in terms of demand generation. So for all of you automotive aftermarket folks listening, certainly you'll be able to apply some of the sort of vignettes that Ben and I are going to discuss today. And I think across any industry, thinking about longitudinal data, their sources, what happens when technology changes, what type of data is being collected, is it good enough? Are there viable substitutes? These are going to be really interesting things that I hope that all of you can take away when you listen to not only this podcast episode, but also some of Ben's. And baseball, right? It doesn't get more American than that. All I need really are a slice of apple pie, a hot dog, and maybe a Chevrolet. But why don't we go ahead and dive in, Ben? So, some of the episodes that I listened to were on the things that I just mentioned, statistics. So, I'm thinking specifically of runs batted in, RBIs, wins, losses, errors. I know that's a lot of them, but do you want to maybe pick one or two of those and just tell us a little bit about how these are defined, the histories, maybe the limitations of some of these stats?
Sure. I mean, so the thing about statistics is, they're numbers and you might see them as just numbers, but at least in baseball, statistics can represent stories. They can represent your idea, your image of a person, of a player. And that can, for better or worse. So I think one great example is, the mystery of Bob Welch. So this was let me just, so in 1990, Bob Welch won the Cy Young Award. He was a pitcher for the Oakland Athletics. And, the mystery here is, how could he have won the Cy Young Award, which is the most coveted award given to a pitcher each year, if he wasn't even the best pitcher in the league? Not only that, he wasn't even the best pitcher on his team. So if you put these things together, how could he win the Cy Young Award? And people who know about baseball, who know a little or even know a lot, they're going to see that and they're going to say, oh, this guy, he must have been the best pitcher, right? But he wasn't, right? His teammate Dave Stewart had a lower earned run average. He gave up less runs throughout the season. Even Roger Clemens that year, he had a 1.93 earned run average, which is unbelievable compared to Welch's 295. And the answer here is Welch won 27 games, right? So he had a lot of wins. And wins was given a lot of emphasis, the number of wins you have. But the number of wins you have is not determined on your play alone. Right? It's about other factors. And so this skewed statistic led not only fans and people, but the powers that be in Major League Baseball to award this guy the Cy Young Award. And, not to take away from Bob Welch, anything we're talking about here, you get to this level, you're a great player, right? You're a great athlete. But when you attribute credit, you have to consider these different factors. And so he had 27 wins, which was a ton of wins. But he wasn't actually even close to the best pitcher in the league. So, looking at statistics and going deeper into them, you can find the truth.
Really interesting point. So so much to unpack there. I'll start with this. 27 wins is certainly a lot. I'm not much of a baseball player, but I remember 20 being a pretty high watermark. Am I remembering that correctly for a season?
Yeah. I think it was 1968. Danny McLean was the last 30-game winner. And Bob Welch had the most wins in 18 years. So again, it was a significant feat. And the question is, I think it was, who said it in Smart Baseball? Keith Law has this book, Smart Baseball, which is, I referenced that for this episode. And he said, to really attribute wins completely to a pitcher, you would have to believe that he's magical, that he can will his teammates to create runs around him, right? Which is, of course, absurd. It has nothing to do. You can be a great pitcher. To point this out, in 1959, for the Pittsburgh Pirates, Harvey Haddix, he pitched 13 perfect innings. A perfect game is extremely rare. You give up no hits, no walks, no errors. He pitched 13 perfect innings, but his
Innings or
teammates,
games? Okay.
what's that?
13 perfect innings or games?
Innings, yeah.
Okay.
But his teammates did not give him any runs, right? So it was 0-0 going into the 13th, and he ended up losing the game and then ended up losing the credit of a perfect game because he didn't win, right? So individually, it was an amazing feat, and yet he didn't get the win, and that skewed how people saw it. So it's really about attributing credit where it belongs, and wins is kind of a false assessment.
Well, that's a great point because when you're pitching, you are on defense and you can't control what your offense is doing. That's borne by the example you just gave. And then tell us a little bit about how a win is defined because I can't remember if you have to start the game or if you're pitching the majority of the innings. Can you shed some light on that?
Sure, this came way back in the late 1800s when they were trying to attribute it, and they gave it to um, the pitcher with the most innings, and it ultimately came to five, right? So 5 innings, but then it starts to change when it's tied or different relief pitchers are coming in terms of who gets a win, so it can get a little complex there. But normally it's 5 innings. If you pitch through 5 innings, then you'll get the win.
Okay. And you mentioned something else that was interesting. You talked about the 30 game winner that was 30 years ago, 60 years ago. And I think about how long pitchers are allowed to pitch in terms of their pitch count, what the rotation is. Can you speak to that a little bit too? Because I
Sure.
think that would certainly affect the number of wins any pitcher could perhaps have as their denominator or that they could possibly win, right?
Absolutely, yeah. So today, the number one concern is, well, I mean, it's funny because you would say the number one concern is saving your pitcher and keeping your pitcher healthy. Um, and so pitchers don't throw complete games anymore. I think it was Yamamoto last year for the Dodgers who threw a complete game, and it was a big deal because they don't do that. But years ago, you would throw complete games, you would pitch more innings, you would pitch more games, which gave you the opportunity to have more wins. So that's a really good point because a lot of these statistics, a lot of these records, they can't be broken anymore because players aren't given the same opportunities because you're trying to preserve a pitcher's arm, right? Meanwhile, you're trying to have them throw 100 miles an hour, which is counterproductive. But because of the changes in the game, and players are making millions and millions of dollars, they're not going to risk hurting their arm to pitch one more inning or get a couple more wins a year. So that really factors in.
Thanks for that perspective. And in the beginning of this conversation, you talked about, was it Bob Welch? Am I getting the name
Mm-hmm.
correct?
Yeah.
You said that he wasn't necessarily the best pitcher, even on his team. So I'm just kind of curious, who was the best pitcher on his team and what were your criteria what was your basis for that?
Sure. So when you look at individual statistics for a pitcher, things that can point out, regardless of your offense around you, um, his teammate was Dave Stewart. So Dave Stewart had a lower earned run average, right, runs per game, which is significant, right? And that's something that you can pin directly on an individual. Dave Stewart also had more strikeouts. And,
Mm,
we're talking about number of innings and complete games, which really doesn't happen much anymore. Dave Stewart had 11 complete games that year compared to Welch's 2. So, when you put these statistics together, it adds up to, yeah, overall, individually, Dave Stewart was much stronger than Bob Welch, but I think he had 21 wins or 22 wins.
still a significant number.
Still
Wow.
significant, but not 27. Right? And that was
Right.
the determining factor.
And something like the Cy Young Award, certainly some subjectivity. You mentioned emphasis. I think weighting, is a statistically oriented nerd type of guy. But do the criteria change from year to year? Because I can imagine where you have statistics, but do they tell the whole story? And maybe as a manager, it's like you're looking at certain things, but the certain presence, the intangibles. Can you tell us a little bit about how those factors can get, are they consistent from year to year, and a little bit about how the Cy Young Award or other awards might be based on?
They certainly do change as it takes a while, right? It takes a while for the culture to shift. So um, the wins is less important now, certainly, and it had become less important after the 1990s, and they're starting to look at what statistics do matter. And a good example is runs batted in. So um, runs batted in is a statistic that measures how many people you're driving in. So a guy's on second base, you hit a double, he comes around and scores, right? So you get an RBI, you get a run batted in. But it's not based on just you. You have to have men on base. And a good example here is, Joe Carter in 1990, he was playing for the Padres. He had the third highest number of RBIs in the league with 115. His batting average was 232, which is extremely low. So what it depended on, what happened that year was he had possibly the three best teammates in front of him to get on base. He had Roberto
Right.
Alomar, he had Tony Gwynn, he had Jack Clark, and they had high on base percentages. And so whenever he stepped up to the plate, there was likely to be someone on base that he could drive in. Now, of course, he had to drive them in still, but you look at Barry Bonds, a controversial player, but still great. In 2001, Barry Bonds hit 73 home runs, right? He destroyed the record. He had 130 some RBIs that year, which, okay, that's a lot of RBIs, but for 73 home runs, it's not that many because
Yeah.
54% of the time when Barry Bonds stepped to the plate, the bases were empty.
Interesting.
So he only drove in his players 64 times. He drove himself in 73 times. So, and for years, these statistics, as you said, they gain weight. They become symbols. And so you just look at, oh, he had this many RBIs. He must be great. And it was so significant that it permeated the game to a degree that, players would get better contracts. They would get more money because of these statistics that weren't actually accurate in representing their defensive or offensive output.
Hmm. And I can imagine, and I think you've already alluded to this in a way, batting position matters, right? If you're the leadoff batter, does that put you in a harder position to have RBI?
Absolutely. I think if you look statistically, um, it changes, but yeah, because, depending on, uh, the fourth inning is going to be different from the first inning, but, if you're the third hitter or the fourth hitter and you have men in front of you who consistently get on base, then, your odds are just going to go up. So that makes a huge difference.
I'm guessing there is a master's PhD level thesis out there somewhere that looks at batters who bat first, controls for that variable, and compares RBIs for leadoff batters versus other batters. If that hasn't been published and somebody writes a thesis about it, please make sure you credit this podcast for that idea.
Yeah, I mean, you could plug that into Google right now and get information because it is out there. Like every position, all of that. It's so stats heavy now that all of that information is out there and readily available.
Absolutely. And another consideration are some of the props that I brought up here, the baseball. I loved your episode talking about the spitball, as well as things like the composition of the ball. Now there's a lot of topics I'll just highlight now, and we can dive into as many as we reasonably can here, but the composition of the ball, the cost of a ball, how long the ball was used, because you watch a game these days or in the last decade or two, many balls can be used at a singular at bat, whereas it was different decades ago. So certainly those can affect the statistics. So maybe let's talk a little bit about the baseball. So any of those topics you want to kind of pick and run with for a little bit, Ben?
Sure, sure. I mean, like my mind pings on so many directions when you talk about the spitball and um, what changes because of it. There was, I just talked about this. There's a quote in the Baseball Research Journal. I don't remember what year it was, but the writer was talking about um, when. So just going back a minute, the spitball was banned, and part of the impetus of that was I think it was 1920. Ray Chapman was killed because he was hit by a pitch. And part of the reason was, the ball was dirty. It was hard to see as, in the gray of the day. And so he was hit in the head and he died. And so um, the spitball was banned. Part of an interesting aspect of this is they grandfathered in people who were still throwing the spitball. So they allowed them to continue pitching.
Okay.
Even though it was banned. So some pitchers were still throwing the spitball for years until they retired. But this change allowed the ball to be replaced, allowed it to be cleaner, and it was bright so you could see it, which definitely changed the impact for hitters because now you can see the ball coming in at 80, 90 miles an hour, and it's going to affect the offense.
Absolutely. And if I can just pause for 1 second, for listeners who may not be familiar with what a spitball is or what exactly is in that spit, Ben, could you just illuminate us?
Yeah, I mean, spitballs, it's gross. Right? It's disgusting because a pitcher will spit on it, but tobacco chewing was a big part of the game in the early days of baseball, and so pitchers would chew tobacco, they would spit on the ball, they would rub it in, and because they didn't replace baseballs very frequently, the ball would have all this spit and disgusting juice on it, and the dirt from the ball field, and it would turn brown and it was very difficult to see and to hit. And so this was a huge advantage for the pitchers, and it also made the game dangerous.
Thanks for that commentary. And just kind of going back to that prop, I mean, a ball like this was the cleanest one I had in my house, but I'm pretty sure if this hit the dirt on a pitch, the umpire would just get rid of it, right?
Yeah, even that ball as it is not as bright as a brand new ball.
Definitely.
And just to this point of, they preserved balls because of cost and culture, but it wasn't until a fan sued. He sued the Giants, I believe it was, in the 1920s because he caught a foul ball and then they tried to take it from him, and he said no, right? And then they put a little kid in jail. The Phillies did because he kept a foul ball, and this started to change the policy. And finally, teams like, okay, fans can keep foul balls, but part of it was because of the balls were rare, right? The balls were expensive.
But the litigious nature of the United States continues to live on, apparently.
Yeah, for better in this example. Yeah.
So you mentioned something interesting, and it was the ball was kept. So the ball back in the early part of the 20th century, if I'm remembering correctly, wound nylon, or was it cork? Can you just tell us a little bit about the composition of the ball and how it changed over the years? And then certainly, if you just use one ball throughout the whole game, it's probably going to get a little mushy, right? And that could perhaps be an advantage for the pitcher, I believe.
Yeah, and I can't recall right now the material, but yeah, it was cork, and then they used different substances, but in different periods. For example, when Babe Ruth came along, there were more home runs, and offensive output went up. The ball was like it was tightened, so it had more pop, right? It's harder, and so it's going to pop more off the bat. Um, and then in 1961, when Roger Maris broke Babe Ruth's record, again there was talk of, okay, well, the ball is livelier, and so that made a difference in these cases.
Interesting. And just for the our listeners and viewers, illumination as well and edification is certainly the standard baseball white with red stitches. you talk a little bit about how different colors were experimented with
Hmm.
and how it was maybe like a one game test and the players were like, bah, right? So I thought that was pretty interesting in terms of for visibility, some advantages to the hitters, but to the pitchers and fans, perhaps there's something about the classic that is just hard to kind of move away from.
Yeah, well, in the late 1800s, Henry Chadwick, who's known, there are many men known as the father of baseball, but he's one of them because he wrote extensively and was weighed in a lot. And he said the white baseball was ridiculous, right? And uh, he suggested or recommended a red baseball, which is kind of connected to cricket. But so there was a red baseball in the late 1800s, and they experimented with different types, and then um, they experimented with a yellow baseball, and that was, I'm trying to think if it was the 1950s. It was the 1950s and 1940s. But there was a scientist, an engineer, who implemented this, and like his argument was yellow is the best color overall to see, especially moving. Hence, stop signs. You know, a lot of the signs are on roads are yellow, and so it's the best sign to see. And it was actually successful. And players during that game said, "Yeah, we could see it well. Batters could see it well." The problem was that the dye in the baseball was rubbing off on the pitcher's hand and clothes, and they didn't
Mm,
have the technology at the time to rectify that, and so it kind of quietly went away. Um, and then um, let's see, one second. So in the 70s, Oakland A's owner Charlie Finley tried the orange ball, right? And he was one for really experimenting and getting publicity for these different things. But again, it was successful, and they didn't test it long enough to see, will a yellow ball, will an orange ball be better? Not only would it um, lift the offensive numbers, which makes the game more exciting and entertaining, but would it make the game safer? Because players can pick up the ball better, and
mm,
so they have just a little bit more time to react if the ball happens to be coming at their head.
right, right. Fascinating. And I feel like we have enough time. We can go into another statistic and some of its influences, and that is, say, errors and fielding.
Mm-hmm.
So maybe before I pull out the glove here, can you tell us what an error is and how that is decided?
It's I think an error is actually, maybe it's not as much now, but it can be subjective, right? Um, for instance, I remember reading something recently about Derek Jeter and not having as many errors playing shortstop. But people argue that, yeah, he didn't have as many errors because he didn't take chances. So if you imagine an infielder, right, and the ball's speeding by him and he doesn't go for it, it's like, oh, he didn't have a chance. But if an infielder actually makes an attempt and he misses it or muffs it, then it's more likely an error, right? So in that case, the more risk you take in going for a ball, um, the higher likelihood, if you make a mistake, it's going to be an error. And the same for the outfield, right? If you see this all the time. There's a line drive or a fly ball, and an outfielder will take a few steps and then he'll let it drop in front of him and he'll, throw it in. Now, if he makes a severe attempt of going for it and makes a mistake, then he'll likely get an error. So
So it's
it can
almost
be
like a
very,
risk mitigation
yeah,
technique. I'm an outfielder. If I let it drop, maybe it's only a single. If I go for the diving ESPN top 10 play, it might become a double, right?
yeah, yeah. And this goes back to, uh, wins. It goes back to, if a perfect game. So again, a perfect game, and you see perfect games, you're likely to just remember the pitcher. But a perfect game requires the fielders to not make any errors, and that's completely separate from the pitcher. And so you have all these intertwining factors that we often don't think about when we look at statistics.
And an error is essentially a mistake that is attributed to a defensive player when he bungles something. And as you're saying, if he chooses not to go for it, typically that would not count against him unless it's so obvious that he really tanked it, I would think, right?
Exactly. Yeah, and it could be, right. It could be like a shortstop mishandling the ball. It could be it goes under his glove. It could be he gets it, but then he makes a throwing error to first base. Right. All of that could add up to an error.
Right. And there's probably some subjectivity. I'm not sure about the nuances of a bad bounce because I feel like the field is pretty uniform. I mean, they sweep it. There's inevitably going to be some imperfections that might lead to a bad bounce, but I would guess that the statistician, the record keeper, has a little bit of latitude and discretion on ascribing error or not, right?
Yeah, and then that opens up a whole other topic because uh, you're talking about the people who tend the grounds, right? The groundskeepers. And
Hmm.
at the turn of the 20th century, baseball fields were not in the best shape. So you had a lot of irregularities. So if you look at errors and statistics from that time, you have to factor in the baseball fields, right? And um, it's interesting too. And I think this was season one. I did an episode on cheating. The role of groundskeepers can play because it was a game versus it was the Giants, the San Francisco Giants versus the LA Dodgers, and the Dodgers had a really fast team. So the Giants groundskeepers were told to make the infield muddier, right? So it would be difficult for the runners to steal bases. And
Interesting.
right, so again, this is a hidden factor in terms of okay, this guy doesn't have that many stolen bases, but maybe the fields were set up against him, right? It's something against that.
Interesting. Yeah, and I mean, not to go down this rabbit hole too much, but certainly baseball diamonds and the shapes are different in terms of the depth of the outfield, what the walls look like. And I think as tennis players, we notice those subtle differences between, say, courts at Marcy Park versus, say, Yorktown High School.
Hmm.
And those are hard courts, but they're going to have their subtleties. And then you look at different surfaces for tennis courts, whether clay, grass, hardcore, and that could be another interesting line of discussion, I would think. But yeah, great point about the fields, and could there be collusion to make it harder for the visiting team, right?
Yeah, yeah. Yeah, well,
Yeah,
the answer is yes. There certainly has been and is because it's accepted, right? People say,
right,
well, it's part of the game. They're allowed to do that. It's not against the rules. And in
right.
baseball,
And I think just talking
people
about
push
the
it.
errors, I brought my softball glove from the 90s, and you had an interesting episode on the history of gloves. And when we think about gloves from the late 1800s to the 1900s or lack thereof, certainly this can affect errors, hitting rates, wins, saves, etc. So, can you tell us a little bit about the gloves?
Sure. And this is for me, like when I find uh, a fact or a story that just blows my mind, of course, I want to, uh, put that together and share it with listeners so they have the same effect. And one of the moments came when I was researching the baseball glove and this idea that uh, for almost 90 years, uh, baseball glove designers were missing a key factor, a key aspect of the glove. Because until 1957, the baseball glove, and if you hold your glove up, right, so your glove, it has what's called a built in hinge in it, okay? So what that means is it makes it easier, it almost closes upon itself, right? But this didn't exist before 1957. So gloves were based on the human hand. And but they're based on the human hand at rest like this. And it's very hard to catch a ball. You can catch it, you can keep it like this, but if you hold your glove up, if you hold it like this, it's going to fall out. So players had to use both hands most of the time. Outfielders, infielders, they had to use both hands. So it took almost 90 years to think of this. And to me, that's amazing. Like, because you know coaches, players, baseball glove designers were trying to innovate. They were trying to make the glove better, but they could not break themselves from this notion that the glove had to look like the hand. And so as the glove evolved, it looked less like the hand, but it became more functional. The pocket grew. And now you have outfielders who can extend their arm with one hand and make catches that were not possible before. And that, again, is going to change the statistics. It's going to change everything about the game.
I mean, catcher's mitts, right? Those have been around for a long time, but as you highlight the evolution of the glove, I mean, the first baseman's glove is probably a little bit different than another position, whether in the infield or in the outfield. Am I remembering that?
Yeah, right. You have different gloves for different positions. The first baseman's glove is bigger because he's fielding so many balls. The catcher's glove is thicker. Um, and, early gloves in the 1800s, because, of course, there was a time prior to the 1870s up until 1896 when players wore no gloves at all, right? And catchers had broken fingers, mangled fingers, obviously, because it was very hard to catch a ball without a glove. And even when they got gloves, they were very thinly padded. And so some catchers would actually put meat, right? They would put beef slabs of meat in their gloves to cushion the impact. Like they would do whatever they could because it was painful.
I can imagine the conversations. Hey, Joe, I've got a New York strip today. What do you got? Oh, I got the ribeye, and I play a lot better with the ribeye. Oh, I'm a T-bone kind of guy, or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, and I wonder if they grilled that up after the game.
Yeah, it's tenderized. Let's cook.
Yeah.
I love it. So, yeah, certainly the equipment, the broken fingers. I mean, and in baseball, you're playing defense and offense. I can only imagine how hard it must have been to be a batter if you're playing with a very thin glove, if any at all, and you're trying to wrap your hands around a bat and hit something that's coming at you at 80, 90 miles an hour. That sounds pretty painful.
Yeah. I mean, you're talking about, the invention of the batting glove, right?
Well, I think even just if you're handling a ball, you're spraining your fingers. And I know as a tennis player, if my finger is sore, I have a blister or chapped hands, it can make a little bit of a difference, and that gets into your head. So I can only imagine as a baseball player when you're hitting some with that much force.
Yeah.
But yeah, batting gloves is certainly another area of exploration. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, it really brings up this conversation about manliness, because that was one of the key reasons men didn't wear gloves. It wasn't manly. It wasn't tough to wear gloves to protect yourself. And so they would suffer these terrible injuries, and their careers could be shortened. Their functionality was decreased because your hands are mangled for the rest of your life. And
right.
But whether you're at the plate and you can't see the ball, or you don't have a helmet, or you're in the field and you don't have a glove, this toughness really covers fear that's unconscious inside, because you're going to have that fear of a dirty ball coming in that you can't see that might hit you in the head. You're going to have that fear in the field, even if, like, I'm tough, I can't admit that I would love a glove right now. It's going to factor in when that ball comes flying towards you. You might flinch unconsciously. And so the more people could admit that they needed protection, they needed help, the more courage, the less fear they had in the field and at the plate. Yeah,
I mean, a little bit of humility can certainly go a long way in the baseball field and so many other avenues of life. So, this has been so much fun talking with you, and I just want to talk a little bit about our hats. So I'm sure some of you might be wondering, why Kansas City, Mike? What's the story behind that? So the story is this. My family and I, we went to a cousin's wedding in Kansas City, maybe about 15 years ago, and we saw a day game of the Kansas City Royals. So it must have been July. So you're probably already putting your head together in terms of, yeah, that would have been a very painful experience. So when you look at the pictures of our family throughout the game, we just like, we're just gradually wilting as the game goes on. A lot of fun, and we even got to have our son go onto the field and run the bases because it was one of those promotional days. We got him a hat. He ended up it got lost a few years later. So on a business trip to that area a few years later, I was able to get a replacement hat for him. So that's kind of the story of the Kansas City hat. And am I a Kansas City fan? Not necessarily. I grew up in West Central Ohio between Cincinnati and Detroit in a town called Lima. So most of the folks in Lima would root for the Cincinnati Reds. I was never really that much of a baseball player, so I just kind of cheer for the home team. But so when I wear this, I just think it's representing part of my family lineage. My middle name is Kim, which is my mother's maiden name, and then my last name Chung. So we got it represented on this hat. So nice. Probably a little bit more than you might have bargained for or expected, but that's the history of my hat. So
that's fun.
Your turn, Ben.
Yeah. So my hat is Field of Dreams, right? Those are the letters on there. This, as I was working on season 1, I actually started to hear a voice inside of me, kind of like the movie, and I doubted it for a while, and it was like, oh, this is cheesy, right? Like, what's going on here? But it happened when I did a story on Moonlight Graham, and I found out that, one of these main characters from this film, Field of Dreams, was actually a real player who had a shot at the majors, played in the field, but never got to get his at bat. I'm like, wow, this is crazy and sad, but also he became a doctor then and helped so many more people than he probably could have as a baseball player. I decided to really look into this, and my whole second season of Midnight Library Baseball is on the making of Field of Dreams. And so I dove deep. I ended up talking to the director, Phil Alden Robinson, and all these people involved. And it's just, there are so many amazing stories surrounding the making of the film that, to me, rival anything that occurs in the film. So that was really meaningful. And now I have listeners who have listened to the season multiple times. It was a labor of love, and it's probably the most intense that I've done. But it was just really rewarding and fun to do.
Congratulations on producing that series. I'm looking forward to listening to that season. And I think as we close up, we've talked a lot about statistics, the history, the interpretation, the context. What might you recommend for our listeners or anybody to consider when they're looking at statistics, whether in sports, in business, or any aspect of life?
I think the reality is that we take shortcuts. It's how we evolved as humans, right? We have to take shortcuts in order to keep moving. And so we go on autopilot. But if you really want to learn the truth about something, then it's often worth digging a little deeper into the first story you see, into the statistics, what's behind it. And I think overall that can be more helpful, not only individually, but as a society, to dig a little deeper into statistics, to find out what actually is true. Because so often, the first thing you see is not, but it's widely accepted, like wins, like RBIs. And I think that can be really helpful.
That's a great point. It's a nice segue and kind of looping us back to the beginning, slowing down, taking your time, especially in this supercharged society and pace of life that we have, where we are getting so many inputs from so many different directions. Taking some time to absorb, ponder, investigate, and sort of slew the way can really be beneficial on so many levels.
Absolutely.
Well, Ben, it's been such a pleasure talking with you. Is there anything else you want to add for our audience regarding statistics in baseball?
No. There's too much to get into, so I think we talked about a plenty.
Okay, great. And just a couple of fun questions to close out. I mentioned you and I know each other from tennis, but are there other hobbies that you'd like to share with our audience, or vacation spots, favorite foods, anything else you'd like to kind of leave behind for our viewers and listeners?
Vacation spots. I wish it was warmer here, so I'm thinking about the Caribbean right now.
Yeah.
And yeah,
Is that a go-to place for you and your family?
it we yeah, my wife and I have gone there from time to time, and we're excited. We're going to Sedona in a couple months, and
Oh,
so
great.
like for me, just checking out this different scenery. To me, the Southwest has amazing scenery and views that you don't get anywhere else. So really excited about that.
Absolutely. Well, thanks so much for sharing and remind the audience where they can find your podcast and materials.
Sure. So the podcast Midnight Library of Baseball you can find on most podcast platforms, iTunes, Spotify, YouTube. You can also go to the website midnightlibraryofbaseball.com. And then I have a Patreon page where I have extra episodes. So I have 17 episodes that you can't find on the regular feed. And so that's Patreon /Midnight Library Baseball. I also have full interviews there and other content. And then I have an Instagram page at Midnight Library Baseball, TikTok, Facebook. So you can find me in all of those places. And if you have questions or show ideas, you can reach out at midnightlibrarybaseball@gmail.com.
Terrific. And Patreon, how do you spell Patreon?
Patreon.
Terrific. Well, Ben, as always, it's been a pleasure having you and seeing you. So thank you so much for joining our program. And to all of our listeners and viewers, thank you for taking time to listen to this episode of Indicators. Have a great day, everybody.
Thanks so much, Mike. Great to be here.